The courtroom was silent, thick with tension. Officer Grant Turner stood tall, pointing at Rebecca Cole, accusing her of breaking into a store. But as the judge turned to her, she dropped a bombshell. Officer Turner is lying, and he doesn't even realize I'm a high-ranking Navy SEAL. The room erupted in gasps. Turner's face went pale. This wasn't just a trial, it was the beginning of a war. Rebecca's calm demeanor hid a storm of secrets, and the truth she was about to reveal would destroy more than just Turner. It would expose a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone could imagine. But as the courtroom braced for her next move, one question lingered. Who was really behind this setup? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? The courtroom was still, like a breath held in suspense. Every pair of eyes was locked on Officer Grant Turner. He stood tall in his police uniform, the silence in the room broken only by the sound of his voice. "I saw her break into that store with my own eyes," he declared, pointing directly at Rebecca Cole, who sat calmly at the defendant's table. She had a crowbar, pried the door open, and ran out with a bag of stolen goods. "That's her, Your Honor. I swear on my badge." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge's cold gaze fixed on Rebecca, but her face remained unreadable. She sat still, her eyes never wavering from Turner's. Dressed in a simple white blouse and navy pants, she appeared like any other regular citizen. But beneath her composed demeanor, there was a storm brewing. The prosecutor stood, a smirk spreading across his face. He could sense the victory. "Your Honor," he said, his voice oozing confidence, "it's clear as day. A respected officer of the law witnessed her committing the crime. What more do we need?" The judge turned to Rebecca. "Miss Cole," he said, his voice firm, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" Rebecca's calm voice sliced through the room. "Officer Turner has made a terrible mistake," she said, her words steady, yet full of purpose. "He's lying under oath, and he doesn't even realize that I'm a high-ranking Navy SEAL." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Gasps echoed from every corner. The prosecutor's smug expression faltered, and Turner's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order! Order in the court!" Rebecca's sharp gaze never left Officer Turner. "Shall we start from the beginning?" she asked, her voice cold, calculating, as if she were about to expose a deep, hidden truth. Rebecca slowly rose from her seat. The courtroom watched in complete silence, every eye on her. She moved gracefully, smoothing out her white blouse, her actions calm, but her presence exuded an undeniable tension. As she stood, she glanced at Officer Turner, whose pale face now betrayed the unease that churned beneath his confident front. "You're wrong, Officer Turner," Rebecca began, her voice smooth, yet piercing, cutting through the heavy silence. "You think you saw me break into that store. You think you saw me commit a crime, but you didn't. You've made a terrible mistake." Her words hung in the air, making the already tense atmosphere even heavier. The audience shifted uneasily, some whispering under their breath. The judge narrowed his eyes, clearly intrigued by her confident statement. The prosecutor, caught off guard, stood rigid, unsure of how to proceed. Rebecca took a step forward, her voice steady and clear. "Officer Turner has lied under oath. And he doesn't know is that I am a high-ranking Navy SEAL." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The gasps quickly turned into murmurs as everyone processed her words. Turner blinked rapidly, clearly stunned by her revelation. He stood frozen, his mouth moving but no words coming out. It was as if the world had stopped spinning for him. The judge's gavel slammed down again. "Order," he commanded, his voice sharp. Rebecca's eyes were now locked onto Turner, her gaze unwavering. She held the courtroom in the palm of her hand, her presence commanding, yet calm. "Shall we start from the beginning?" she asked, her voice almost a challenge. The room fell silent again. All eyes were on her, waiting to hear the truth that Rebecca was about to reveal. The truth that would turn everything upside down. It had started as just another ordinary day for Rebecca. She had just finished a workout at the gym, the duffel bag slung over her shoulder as she walked home. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet street. As she passed a small convenience store, something caught her eye. Sitting on the curb outside the store was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His clothes were ragged, his face pale, and his eyes avoided hers as if he didn't want to be seen. Rebecca's heart tightened at the sight of him. There was something about the way he sat, his shoulders hunched in defeat, that pulled her in. Without a second thought, she approached him, crouching down beside him. "Hey, you okay, buddy?" she asked, her voice gentle. The boy hesitated before slowly lifting his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were full of sadness, but there was also a flicker of relief. "I lost my money," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Rebecca looked over at the store. Through the window, you're watching them, his eyes suspicious and cold. Rebecca knew how the world could be, how people could be quick to judge and slow to help. She smiled at the boy, her heart warming despite the tension in the air. "You hungry?" she asked softly. The boy nodded shyly, and without hesitation, Rebecca stood and extended her hand to him. "Come on," she said, her tone light. "Let's get you something to eat." Together, they entered the store. Rebecca let the boy pick out what he wanted. He chose a sandwich, a bottle of milk, and an apple. She paid for it all, giving the boy a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You're good now," she said with a smile. But as they stepped out of the store, something unexpected happened. A police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of them, the sound cutting through the calm evening. Officer Grant Turner, his face set with purpose, jumped out of the car. His eyes immediately locked onto Rebecca, and without missing a beat, he barked, "You, stop right there." Rebecca frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "Excuse me?" she asked, the calmness in her voice belying the confusion she felt. Turner stepped forward, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for breaking and entering," he declared, his voice cold and authoritative. "Witnesses saw a woman matching your description breaking into this store earlier. You're coming with me." Rebecca's eyes darkened, disbelief settling in her chest. "That's a mistake, officer," she said, her voice low and steady. But Turner didn't listen. Within seconds, her hands were yanked behind her, cold metal snapping around her wrists. As she was pushed toward the squad car, she saw the young boy's face in the distance. He was staring at her in shock, his mouth open in disbelief. "She didn't do anything," he shouted. "She was helping me." Turner ignored the boy, pushing Rebecca into the back seat of the police car. Her mind raced. This wasn't just a mistake, it was something more. Turner didn't just think she was guilty. He was trying to bury the truth. And Rebecca knew that something was about to happen that would change everything. As Rebecca sat in the back of the squad car, her mind raced. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into her wrists, but it was the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior that gnawed at her. She had been arrested for something she didn't do, and Officer Turner wasn't even trying to listen to her side. The world outside the car blurred as the car sped toward the precinct. Her chest tightened with frustration. She couldn't just sit back and let this mistake unfold. No one else seemed to care. The young boy's voice, his desperate plea, echoed in her mind. He was the only one who had witnessed the truth, and yet no one believed him. Turner had no evidence, no proof of any crime. He had simply made up his mind. As they pulled into the precinct parking lot, Rebecca's jaw clenched. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to sit in a cell while Turner went on with his lies. Someone was behind this. Someone was manipulating the entire situation, and she was determined to find out who. The officer on into the interrogation room, his hands rough as he yanked her out of the car. The door slammed shut behind her as she was shoved into the cold, sterile room. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of how she could turn this around. She was about to speak when the door swung open again, and Officer Turner entered. He didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on the floor as he took a seat across from her. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You think you can get away with lying your way out of this?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him, her expression cold. She wanted to lash out, to make him see the truth. But she couldn't afford to lose control. She had to play this smart. Turner shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly trying to hold on to whatever semblance of authority he had left. He cleared his throat, glancing up at her for a moment, then quickly looking away. "I don't know who you this time. You're not walking away unscathed." Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken words. She could feel the rage bubbling beneath her skin. This was more than just a false accusation. This was about power, and Turner was protecting someone much bigger than himself. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Turner's face twisted, the mask of bravado slipping for just a second. His eyes darted around the room, his hands fidgeting on the table as if he were trying to hold himself together. Rebecca didn't wait for him to respond. "You're not the one who's in control here," she said, her voice sharp. "You don't even know who you're working for, but I will find out. And when I do, I'm coming for you." Turner swallowed hard, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. He leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the armrest as if it were his only lifeline. Rebecca's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to Turner. "You have no idea who you're messing with." His gaze met hers for a moment, his fear now obvious. And in that instant, Rebecca knew. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a setup. She could feel it deep in her gut. Someone was orchestrating all of this from the shadows. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and they had used Turner as a pawn in their game. Turner's voice broke the silence. "You'll never make it out of here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They'll come for you, just like they did with me." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. "Who are they, Turner? Who are you protecting?" For a moment, Turner didn't speak, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. He was terrified. Terrified of the people he was involved with, terrified of the consequences of crossing them. And that fear was his weakness. Rebecca leaned in, her voice soft but deadly. "You're running out of time. Tell me who they are, and maybe I'll help you. But if you stay silent, I will make sure they regret it." Turner hesitated, his hands shaking as he stared down at the table. The tension in the room was unbearable, but Rebecca knew she was getting closer. She was pushing him to the edge, and soon he would break. Rebecca's mind raced. She knew Turner had just cracked, but she needed more. She wasn't about to leave this room without the answers she needed. The evidence was out there. She just had to get Turner to give it up. She watched him closely, noticing how his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. His fear was palpable, but his silence was stronger. She could see he was fighting it, fighting the urge to speak. He was scared, but of what? Who was he really afraid of? Rebecca didn't have time to waste. She leaned in, her voice calm but laced with menace. "I don't care if you're scared, Turner. You've already made your choice, but now it's my turn, and I will make sure the truth comes out." Turner looked at her, his eyes darting around the room. He was trapped, and Rebecca knew it. He could either give her what she wanted or let it all come crashing down on him. "I know you have something, Turner. You're not just lying because you want to," Rebecca continued, her tone unyielding. "You're covering for someone powerful, and I'm going to find them." For a long moment, Turner said nothing. Then, finally, he opened his mouth, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "I didn't want to do it, but they made me." Rebecca's heart raced. Who made you do it?" He flinched, eyes full of panic. I can't say. They'll come for me. Who?" Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. She wasn't going to let him drag this out. Turner hesitated, but the fear in his eyes was enough to make her push harder. "It's not just a few bad cops," he whispered. "It's bigger. They're everywhere, inside the system. The Black Vipers." Rebecca's mind snapped into overdrive. The Black Vipers. She had heard rumors of them before, whispers of an underground syndicate that ran the city from the shadows. Drugs, money, weapons. But this was bigger. The corruption had deep roots. And Turner, he was nothing more than a pawn caught in their web. She didn't let him see the shock on her face. Instead, she focused on the next move. "Where do I find them?" she asked, her voice cold. Turner's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained weak. "I don't know. They don't tell me anything. But they meet. They meet at Pier 19 on Friday night, midnight." Rebecca's mind clicked into place. She was getting closer. The information was all she needed to set her plan into motion. "Thank you, Turner," she said, her voice calm as she stood up. "You've just given me exactly what I need." Rebecca's heart was pounding as she left the interrogation room. The Black Vipers, an organization with fingers in every pie, from law enforcement to criminal enterprises. Turner had just confirmed everything she suspected, but she needed to make sure that the information wasn't just a random admission in a moment of fear. She knew one thing for sure: Turner wasn't the only one involved. The people behind the Black Vipers were deep inside the system, manipulating events from the shadows. They had their hands in law enforcement, the government, and every dirty deal that could be made. The weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders. As she walked down the cold hallway, her mind raced. She had to be careful. The stakes had just skyrocketed. There was no turning back now. Every move she made, every decision, would either bring her closer to the truth or seal her fate. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, and she turned, ready to face whatever was coming. But it wasn't just one person. A group of men in dark suits entered the hallway, their eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone. Rebecca's instincts kicked in, and she tensed, her mind going into overdrive. She didn't wait for them to notice her. With a quick glance over her shoulder, she bolted. The men were closing in, but Rebecca was faster. She sprinted toward the emergency exit, her heart racing with adrenaline. She could hear the footsteps behind her getting closer, but she refused to slow down. She burst through the door and into the parking lot, scanning the area for a way out. Her eyes locked onto a car parked in the distance, and she sprinted toward it. But just as she was about to reach it, she saw a figure moving in the shadows, a tall man with a dark expression on his face. "Turner!" Rebecca shouted, her voice filled with urgency. She wasn't about to let him escape this easily. He froze, his face turning pale as he turned to face her. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice shaking. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there, something Rebecca couldn't quite place. "What are you running from, Turner?" she demanded. "I know you're hiding something. You're working for the Black Vipers, aren't you?" Turner's eyes flickered with panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, he bolted. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She was faster, stronger, and she was ready for this. With one swift move, she chased him down, her Navy SEAL training kicking in as she sprinted across the lot. Turner's desperation only fueled her determination. She caught up with him quickly, her body moving like a predator hunting its prey. She tackled him to the ground, the impact sending shockwaves through her body. He tried to fight back, but it was futile. She had him pinned in seconds, her knee pressed into his back as she held him down. "Turner, stop fighting," she commanded, her voice cold. "You're not going anywhere." He thrashed beneath him in ragged gasps. "Let me go. You don't know what you're doing." "They'll kill me if you don't," Rebecca cut him off. "They're not going to kill you, but I am going to make sure you talk." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, pressing the record button. "We're going to get this all on tape, Turner. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." But before she could say another word, a loud noise interrupted the moment, sirens blaring in the distance, fast approaching. She knew she didn't have much time. She looked at Turner, who was still struggling beneath her. The fear in his eyes was undeniable. It was clear that whatever he was involved in was much bigger than just a few dirty cops. And now, Rebecca was about to take down the entire network. As the sirens grew louder, Rebecca took a deep breath, her mind calculating every move. The game was changing. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom anymore. She was fighting for the truth. And nothing, not even the Black Vipers, was going to stop her. The tension in the air was electric. Rebecca's hand was still on Turner's wrist, keeping him pinned to the cold ground. His breath was quick and shallow, his body still thrashing beneath her. But she wasn't letting him go. Not yet. "Who are you protecting, Turner?" Rebecca asked again, her voice a low growl, her eyes locked onto his with a deadly intensity. The truth was just within reach. She could feel it. But Turner wasn't going to give up the names without a fight. "I told you, I can't," Turner stammered, his voice shaky. "You don't understand. They'll come for me." "They'll," he broke off, unable to finish the sentence, his face twisted in fear. Rebecca pressed harder, her knee digging into his back. "Stop being so dramatic," she snapped. "Who are they? Who are you covering for? The Black Vipers aren't just a street gang, are they? They're much bigger than that." Turner's silence spoke volumes. His face grew even paler, and his eyes darted to the shadows around them, as though expecting someone to jump out of the darkness and silence them both. The weight of the situation was finally catching up to him, and his fear was palpable. Rebecca wasn't about to give up. She needed him to crack. She needed him to talk, but she wasn't going to waste any more time with threats. It was time to make him feel the pressure of his choices. "You think I'm scared of what they'll do to me?" she said, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I've been in worse situations than this. But you've made a deal with the devil, and now you're going to pay the price. If you don't start talking, I'll make sure everyone knows just how deep you are in this mess. You'll never get out. They'll leave you to rot." Turner's body tensed beneath her, and for a moment, Rebecca thought he was going to snap. Then, finally, his voice broke through the tension, barely a whisper. "Pier 19, he said, his words barely audible. "Friday night, midnight. That's where they'll meet." Rebecca leaned in, making sure she heard every word. "Who's there?" Turner's eyes flickered, and he swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "I don't know. They don't tell me everything. But there's a man there. He runs the operation. Vincent Crowe. He's the one you need to talk to." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. Vincent Crowe. The name echoed in her mind, but she didn't have time to think. She had what she needed. She was closer than ever to bringing the whole operation down. But before she could get another word out, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approached. Too many, too fast. Rebecca looked up, her instincts kicking in. She wasn't about to let Turner escape this time. She sprang to her feet in one fluid motion, her mind racing. She couldn't waste any more time here. She had to get the information out of Turner and make her move. But the approaching footsteps signaled that her time was up. They were coming for her, coming for Turner, still struggling to get up, seemed to sense it too. His eyes widened with panic as the footsteps grew louder. "You have to go," he shouted. "They're coming." Rebecca didn't hesitate. She grabbed his collar and yanked him up. "Get up," she barked. "We don't have much time. If you want to stay alive, you'll help me." With one last glance, Rebecca bolted toward the exit. The sirens were growing louder, and the sound of running footsteps behind her told her everything she needed to know. Someone was coming for her, and they weren't about to let her get away. She needed to move fast. She had no time to waste. Turner, still in a daze, stumbled along behind her, but Rebecca's pace never faltered. The game had changed again. She wasn't just up against the Black Vipers anymore. She was up against a whole system designed to keep her silent. And she wasn't backing down. Rebecca's pulse pounded in her ears as she sprinted through the dimly lit parking lot. Her shoes slapped against the pavement, and her breath came in sharp bursts. The sound of running footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder, closer. She glanced over her shoulder. Turner was struggling to keep up, his face pale with panic. "Keep up, Turner," she shouted, her voice sharp, forcing him to move faster. The clock was ticking, and she had no time to waste. They rounded a corner of the building, and Rebecca's mind raced. She had to get to safety, but she couldn't let Turner slip through her fingers. He had the information she needed, information that would bring down the Black Vipers once and for all. Just as she was about to push open a side door, she heard it, a distant screech of tires. The sound cut through the night, and Rebecca's instincts screamed at her to move. She grabbed Turner by the arm, yanking him with her as she darted toward the alley. They had seconds, maybe less. "Move, move, move," she urged him, her voice low and urgent. She knew they had to get out of sight before they were surrounded. Turner's face was a mask of fear as he stumbled along beside her, his hands still cuffed behind his back. As they turned the corner, Rebecca glanced over her shoulder again. And that's when she saw them. Flashlights. Dozens of them. A group of men in dark suits were coming toward them, their shadows flickering like ghosts in the night. Rebecca didn't think twice. She grabbed Turner and pushed him toward a nearby dumpster, shoving him behind it for cover. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice calm but urgent. She flattened herself against the wall, her breathing steady as she waited for the men to pass. She could feel the tension in the air, like a wire stretched tight, ready to snap. The footsteps grew louder. Then there was a sudden shout. "There they are!" Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. They had been spotted. In an instant, she was on her feet, pulling Turner along with her as they sprinted toward the street. Her mind raced, calculating their every move, but there was no time to think. She had to keep moving, keep running. The sound of heavy boots pounding against the pavement echoed behind them as they ran through the dark streets. Rebecca's muscles burned, but she ignored the pain. She had a job to do. The Black Vipers were closing in, and she wasn't about to let them get away. As they turned the corner, she spotted it, a dark alleyway, just wide enough for them to slip through. "This way," she barked, and Turner followed, his fear giving him the push he needed to move faster. The alley was narrow, the walls closing in on them as they sprinted between them. The sound of pursuit grew fainter behind them, but Rebecca knew they weren't safe yet. They had to make it to the safe house. She had to get the evidence. She had to take down the Black Vipers, once and for all. But they weren't the only ones in the city tonight. They were being hunted. And Rebecca could feel the hunter's gaze on her, knowing that every step they took would bring them closer to the final confrontation. A gunshot rang out in the distance, and the sound made her heart skip a beat. She could hear the men shouting, their voices full of rage as they chased her. They were getting closer. Rebecca's mind was a storm of thoughts as she turned the corner and ducked into another alley. Turner was barely keeping up now, his face drenched in sweat. His fear was becoming contagious. But Rebecca didn't have time for fear. She didn't have time to think about what was coming next. She just had to keep moving, keep ahead of the storm. She glanced over at Turner, his face a mixture of exhaustion and terror. He was out of breath, stumbling along behind her. "Stay with me, Turner," she warned, her voice low and controlled. "We're not done yet, not by a long shot." The sound of their pursuers was growing louder, but Rebecca didn't slow down. She knew that if she stopped now, it would be over. The Black Vipers would take her down, and she wasn't about to let that happen. They turned another corner, their pace quickening as they reached a street lined with cars. The night was alive with sound, the city's pulse beating beneath their feet. But there was no turning back. Rebecca was about to face the storm, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The city streets blurred around Rebecca as she sprinted, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the night. Her heart pounded, but her focus never wavered. Turner stumbled behind her, struggling to keep pace, but Rebecca was relentless. She wasn't just running from the Black Vipers. She was chasing the truth, and nothing was going to stop her. She could feel the cool night air stinging her face as she turned a corner, her mind calculating every move. Turner's breath was ragged, his legs giving out under the pressure. "Hurry up," she snapped, pushing him forward, but she couldn't afford to let him slow her down. She needed him. He had information that would bring the Black Vipers to their knees, and she wasn't about to let them slip through her fingers. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The men in dark suits were closing in, but Rebecca was faster. She pushed herself harder, each step fueled by adrenaline and a deep, unyielding determination. The night was dark, never been more alert. Every sound, every movement was amplified in her mind, and she was ready for whatever was coming. Turner stumbled again, his knees buckling beneath him. He fell to the ground with a muffled grunt. Rebecca paused just long enough to grab his arm and yank him back to his feet. "You're not done yet," she growled, her voice low and firm. She wasn't going to let him drag her down, not now, not when they were so close. They continued running, zigzagging through alleyways, their footsteps echoing off the walls as they dodged in and out of the shadows. Rebecca's mind raced, but she had one goal: get to Pier 19. The Black Vipers were there, waiting, and she wasn't going to give them the upper hand. She could hear the sirens wailing in the distance, and for a split second, she thought about turning back. Maybe she could escape, maybe not, but she couldn't let them get away. The Black Vipers had to be stopped, and she was the only one who could do it. No backup plan, just Rebecca Cole and whatever it took to finish the job. They reached a dead end, an abandoned street that cut off their path. Rebecca's eyes darted around, searching for an exit, but there was nothing. The Black Vipers were catching up. Turner's face was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead, his body trembling with fear. "They're almost here," Turner whispered, his voice shaky. "They'll find us. It's over." "Not yet," Rebecca said, her voice filled with steel. "You're not giving up on me now." She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a narrow alley between two buildings. She knew it was risky, but it was their only chance. The alleyway led to a set of rooftops, and if she could get up there, they might be able to escape. The sound of running footsteps drew closer, and Rebecca's instincts kicked into overdrive. She looked around one last time and saw a fire escape just ahead. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, pulling Turner along behind her. "Climb!" she shouted, urgency in her voice. Turner hesitated for a moment, but Rebecca didn't wait. She grabbed the rungs of the ladder and began to climb, her fingers finding purchase on the metal steps. She pulled herself up, feeling the burn in her arms, but she didn't stop. Turner followed, his breath labored, but he was finally moving at her pace. They reached the rooftop just as the Black Vipers rounded the corner. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder, her pulse quickening. The men were closing in, but they couldn't follow them up here, not without a fight. Rebecca crouched low, signaling for Turner to stay quiet. She could hear the men's voices below, their steps heavy as they scanned the street. They were getting closer, but Rebecca's mind was sharp. She had the advantage now. She took a deep breath, focusing. Her military training kicked in, and she immediately assessed her surroundings. The rooftops were her domain now, and she would use them to her advantage. Turner was still breathing heavily, his face pale as he watched her. "How are we going to get out of this?" he whispered, his voice full of fear. Rebecca didn't answer. She knew she had to stay ahead of them. She moved silently, finding the next building across the alleyway. Distance between the rooftops was small, but it was enough to give them a head start. She glanced at Turner. "Stay close," she ordered, "and don't make a sound." With that, she jumped across the gap, landing lightly on the other rooftop. Turner hesitated for a moment, his fear threatening to paralyze him, but Rebecca didn't wait. She turned and extended a hand to him. "You can do this," she urged. "Just jump." Turner nodded, his fear giving way to a grim determination. He took a deep breath and followed her, leaping across the gap. He landed awkwardly, but he was with her. Together, they ran across the rooftops, the Black Vipers trailing them below. They had a lead, but for how long? They didn't have much time before their pursuers figured out their next move. Rebecca's mind raced, her every move calculated as she pushed ahead. She knew the chase was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of old leather and stale coffee. Rebecca stood at the far end, her eyes locked on Turner, who was sitting across from her, his hands cuffed to the table. He looked worn out, pale, like a man who had just come to terms with the fact that his world was about to collapse. Rebecca didn't say a word at first. She simply watched him, her gaze piercing. She had all the time in the world. Turner wasn't going anywhere, not until he gave her the answer she needed. "Turner," she began, her voice calm but filled with authority. "You're going to tell me everything. No more lies, no more games. The Black Vipers, they're not just a small-time operation, are they?" Turner flinched, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding her gaze. He was shaking. She could see the panic slowly creeping into his expression. But this time, Rebecca wasn't going to give him the chance to hide. She stepped closer, her boots echoing off the floor, a steady rhythm of urgency. "You can keep pretending. Rebecca said, her voice soft, almost gentle. But deep down, you know you don't have a choice. They've backed you into a corner, haven't they? Turner looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. He swallowed hard, but his mouth was dry. He was breaking, she could see it. The fear had finally settled in, and it was the fear of what he had done, not just the fear of what was coming. Just tell me who's at the top of all this, Rebecca pressed. Who's pulling the strings? Who's running the Black Vipers? He trembled, his hands resting uselessly on the table. His voice was a mere whisper when he spoke. I don't know who they are. They don't tell me their names, but I know the man who runs it all, Vincent Crowe. Rebecca's breath caught. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Vincent Crowe. She had suspected the name before, but hearing it from Turner's lips was confirmation. Crowe was the key. Where can I find him? Rebecca demanded, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Where does he meet? Where does he hide? Turner hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. Pier 19, he muttered. That's where they meet. Every Friday night at midnight. Rebecca's mind went into overdrive. Pier 19 was where it all began, the place where she could finally bring the Black Vipers down. Turner had just given her the final piece of the puzzle, and now she could move forward. But you need to understand something, Turner said, his voice low and shaking. Crowe, he's not just some criminal. He's connected. He's connected to people in high places. You're not just dealing with a gang, you're dealing with a network, and it goes all the way to the top. Rebecca's mind raced. She already knew the Black Vipers were dangerous, but hearing that they had ties to people in power changed everything. She wasn't just dealing with street-level criminals anymore. This was something much bigger, something that went beyond her mission. It was about taking down a system that was rotting from the inside out. She leaned in, her voice firm. I don't care how deep it goes, she said, her eyes locking onto Turner's. I will find them, and when I do, I will bring them down. But you're going to help me. You're going to help me take down Crowe. Turner's face twisted in fear. You don't understand, he pleaded. If you go after Crowe, you won't just be dealing with him. You'll be dealing with the people he answers to. People far worse than anything you've ever seen. Rebecca took a deep breath. That's exactly why I'm going after him. With that, she stood up, her mind already on the next move. She had the information she needed. The next step was clear. But she knew that Turner wasn't the only one who would be caught in the web of the Black Vipers. She was already in too deep. There was no turning back now. The weight of the situation pressed down on Rebecca, but there was no hesitation in her movements. Turner had given her the intel she needed, the key to ending the Black Vipers' reign of terror. The game had changed, and now it was time to play her cards. She stood in front of the map, a piece of paper with scribbled notes and locations spread out in front of her. Her eyes flicked from one point to another as she pieced together the puzzle. Pier 19, the meeting spot, Vincent Crowe, the man behind the Black Vipers. And now, a bigger picture was emerging. The Black Vipers weren't just another street gang. They had their claws in law enforcement, in politics, in the very fabric of the city. Rebecca ran her hand through her hair, frustration building. She had the hard part, tracking down Crowe, finding out where he operated, and figuring out how to stop him. But she was dealing with more than just criminals. She was up against a system built to protect its own. But Rebecca was no stranger to impossible odds. In fact, she thrived on them. Turning toward the small window in the safe house, she gazed out at the city beyond, the lights twinkling in the distance. There were too many shadows in this city, too many secrets hidden behind closed doors, and now she was about to expose them all. She wouldn't stop until every single person connected to the Black Vipers was held accountable. Rebecca took a deep breath. She knew the risks. She wasn't just putting herself in danger. She was putting everyone she cared about in harm's way. But that was a price she was willing to pay. The Black Vipers needed to be taken down. No more hiding behind corrupt systems. No more hiding in the shadows. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It was personal. She turned back to Turner, who was sitting in the corner, his face drawn with exhaustion. The truth was out, but there was still work to do. Turner, she said, her voice firm, you've told me what I needed to know. But now, you're going to help me finish this. Turner looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. How? How can I help you? I've told you everything I know. You have to understand, Rebecca. These people are dangerous. They have people everywhere. You can't just walk in and take them down. Rebecca's expression hardened. I'm not just walking in, Turner. I'm bringing the fight to them. And you're going to help me get to Crowe. We'll take him down together. His eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know how much help I can be. They've already got their sights set on me. Rebecca's gaze softened, but her voice remained resolute. You're not alone anymore. I'll make sure they don't get to you. But you owe me, Turner. You owe me for every lie, every life you've helped ruin. And now, you're going to help me fix this." Turner hesitated for a long moment, but finally he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," he muttered. "I'll help you. But you have to promise me something." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Promise me you won't do this alone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Promise me you'll have backup. You can't go in without backup." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll take care of it," she said, though in truth, she knew there was no way to guarantee safety. But Turner was right about one thing. She couldn't afford to be reckless. The Black Vipers were everywhere, and they had people on the inside. Rebecca turned back to the map, her mind already planning her next move. The Black Vipers had made their mistake. They thought they could control everything. They thought they could stay hidden. But Rebecca was about to expose everything. And when that truth came to light, no one would be safe from the fallout. She looked at Turner one last time. "Pack your things," she ordered. "We're going to Pier 19. Tonight." The night air was thick with tension as Rebecca crouched low behind a rusted metal container on Pier 19. The moonlight cast long shadows across the pier, and the faint sound of waves lapping against the docks was the only thing breaking the silence. She could feel the weight of the situation in her bones. The Black Vipers were close, and she wasn't here to play games. She checked her watch, 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes until midnight. Time was running out. Her pulse was steady, but her mind was sharp, calculating every move she would make once the clock struck 12. Turner was beside her, looking more nervous than ever. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows. Rebecca didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the scene in front of her. There were men scattered around the pier, talking quietly among themselves, but none of them seemed to notice the two of them hiding in the darkness. Rebecca knew that this meeting wasn't just a casual exchange. It was where the Black Vipers made their deals, where their network operated in the open, and where she'd find the answers she needed. "Stay focused, Turner," she snapped, her tone hard. "You're not here to ask questions. You're here to help me take them down." He nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Rebecca understood. The Black Vipers weren't just a gang. They were a well-oiled machine, a criminal empire with far-reaching influence. Crow was at the top, pulling the strings. But who else was involved? That was the question Rebecca needed to answer tonight. The seconds ticked by, each one bringing them closer to the confrontation. Then the sound of a car engine roared in the distance. Rebecca tensed, her hand instinctively going to the gun tucked at her side. A black SUV appeared, its headlights cutting through the dark, slowly creeping onto the pier. The vehicle stopped just ahead, and the doors opened. Two men stepped out, their faces hard and expressionless. One was tall, with a scar running down the side of his face, a clear mark of his violent past. The other was shorter, older, and wore an air of calculation, his eyes scanning the area before settling on the cargo area of the pier. Rebecca's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. She had seen these men before. These were Crow's enforcers. They weren't just here for a simple meeting. They were prepared for something far more dangerous. "Stay down," Rebecca whispered to Turner as she crouched lower, her body pressed against the cold metal. She peered through the gaps in the container, watching as the two men conversed briefly before the older one turned toward the warehouse, signaling for the others to follow. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. There was no turning back now. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. She slowly pulled her phone from her pocket, tapping out a message to Ethan, her contact in the FBI, who was monitoring the operation from afar. "We're in position, waiting for the exchange. Proceed with caution." A flash of movement caught her attention. One of the men in the group stepped forward, pulling out a briefcase from the trunk of the SUV. This was it, the transaction, the moment where Crow and his associates made their... Rebecca's fingers twitched on the trigger of her gun. She had to stay patient, stay calm. The tall man with the scar moved to the side, glancing at the shadows. His eyes locked onto Rebecca's position for a moment, and she froze, holding her breath. Had he spotted her? Was this the end of the line? But just as quickly, the man turned away, dismissing the moment. Rebecca exhaled sharply, relieved but wary. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The older man stepped forward, exchanging a few words with the group. Crow hadn't arrived yet, but Rebecca knew he was close. The tension in the air was thick, each second passing slower than the last. The moment they'd been waiting for was coming, and Rebecca was ready. As the group settled around the briefcase, Rebecca took one final glance at Turner, who was barely holding it together. He had no idea what he was about to witness, but Rebecca knew one thing: if Crow and his men weren't stopped tonight, the city would never be the same. Then, without warning, the sound of an engine revved louder as a sleek black car appeared at the entrance of the pier. Crow was here. Rebecca's breath hitched, her hand tightening around the grip of her gun. It was time. This was the moment where everything changed. The black car screeched to a halt just feet away from Rebecca's hiding spot. The air grew still as the engine died, the quiet tension settling over the entire pier. Every muscle in Rebecca's body was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. Crow stepped out of the car, his presence as chilling as the night air. He was tall, imposing, his every movement deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He was the one pulling the strings, the mastermind behind it all, and Rebecca's focus was locked on him. Tonight, this was the man she needed to take down. Crow adjusted his suit jacket, glancing around the pier. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the area with practiced precision, taking in every detail. He knew something wasn't right, but he couldn't yet pinpoint where the danger was coming from. Rebecca had the advantage for now. The element of surprise was hers, but she had to be quick, decisive, no room for mistake. Turner, still crouched beside her, was tense, his eyes darting nervously between Rebecca and the black vipers. "This is crazy," he whispered. "We should back out. This is too much." Rebecca's gaze never left Crow as she whispered back, her voice firm. "We don't have time to back out. You stick to the plan." She adjusted her position slightly, watching as Crow spoke with the two men from the SUV. The briefcase was handed off, but Rebecca couldn't focus on that. Her target was moving. She needed to act now. Without warning, she pulled out her pistol, her eyes narrowing with deadly intent. She took aim, her breath steady as she lined up the shot. First guard's head snapped back as the bullet hit him between the eyes, the sound of the shot barely registering in the thick air. Pandemonium erupted. Crow's head whipped around, his eyes widening in surprise. The black vipers scrambled for cover, shouting orders to each other. It was chaos, pure and simple. The men were armed, pulling guns from holsters, but Rebecca was already on the move. She dove to the side, rolling behind a stack of crates just as bullets whizzed past her. The heat of the gunfire cut through the air, but she didn't flinch. She trained for this moment, prepared for every possibility. Another guard came into her line of sight. Without hesitation, Rebecca fired, hitting him square in the chest. He dropped like a rag doll, his gun falling to the ground with a dull thud. But it wasn't over. Crow was still out there, and he was trying to escape. Rebecca darted from cover to cover, each move calculated, deliberate. Her mind was focused solely on one thing, Crow. The chaos around her was nothing more than background noise. She had a job to do, and she wasn't leaving until it was done. She reached the edge of the pier, just in time to see Crow darting toward the exit, his bodyguards flanking him on both sides. It was now or never. "Turner!" Rebecca shouted as she ran past him. "Keep them busy. Don't let Crow get away." Turner hesitated for a moment but then nodded, scrambling to his feet. He wasn't a fighter like Rebecca, but he had enough fight in him to follow through. He raised a gun he'd picked up from one of the fallen men and fired off a few warning shots. Rebecca didn't wait to see if he was successful. She had one goal now, Crow. She sprinted toward him, the sound of her boots pounding against the pier drowned out by the roar of the firefight behind her. Crow's guards turned to face her, but Rebecca was too fast. With a fluid motion, she threw a punch that landed square on the jaw of the closest bodyguard, sending him reeling backward. As he stumbled, Rebecca pushed past him, keeping her eyes on Crow. She was closing the distance between them, but he was already inside a waiting black SUV, the engine roaring to life. Rebecca was almost there, just a few more steps. But before she could reach the vehicle, the door slammed shut and the car sped off, tires screeching as it tore away from the pier. She was too late. Frustration boiled in her chest, but she didn't stop. She fired 2 shots into the air, signaling Turner to follow her. They couldn't let Crow escape, not after everything that had happened. "Move!" she shouted to Turner, her voice full of urgency. "Get in the car. We're going after him." As Turner ran to catch up, Rebecca's mind raced. This was far from over. Crow had slipped away tonight, but she knew he wouldn't get far. She had the answers, she had the intel, and she wasn't going to stop until she brought him down. Rebecca's eyes scanned the dimly lit diner as she pushed open the door, her instincts on high alert. The stale scent of burnt coffee and grease hit her instantly, but she barely noticed. She was looking for something else, something more dangerous. She moved carefully, her steps quiet but purposeful, keeping her back to the wall as she walked inside. Ethan Hayes, her ally from the FBI, was already sitting in the back booth, his gaze sweeping the room. He gave her a brief nod when he saw her, but there was a hint of tension in his eyes. Something wasn't right, and he knew it. Rebecca slid into the booth across from him, her back still against the wall. She didn't say a word at first, just observed. The diner was nearly empty, except for a few tired patrons hunched over their meals. But Rebecca had learned to trust her gut, and something about the atmosphere tonight felt wrong. "Got the intel," Rebecca said quietly, pulling the burner phone from her pocket and sliding it across the table. Kane's operation is deeper than we thought. Crow's just one part of the machine. Ethan took the phone, glancing at the screen for a moment. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he read the message. This is bad, Rebecca. Kane is pulling strings all over this city. We can't just attack him head on. Too many people in high places are backing him. Rebecca's jaw tightened. I don't care who's backing him. We've already exposed part of the system. Now we go after him, full force. Before Ethan could respond, the hairs on the back of Rebecca's neck stood on end. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden change in energy in the diner. Her instinct screamed that something was about to go down. She subtly shifted her gaze to the reflection in the diner's window, scanning the room. A man in a dark jacket was sitting near the counter, his eyes locked on her. And then she saw the others. 2 men by the jukebox, a third by the door. They were waiting, watching. They were all too calm. Rebecca's fingers instinctively hovered over the handle of her gun. Get ready, she muttered to Ethan. We've been made. Just as she reached for her weapon, one of the men by the door stood up. His hand moved to his hip, and Rebecca knew instantly that they were surrounded. There was no way out through the front door now. The man grinned, a slow, calculating smile. Going somewhere, Cole? He sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Rebecca didn't answer. Her gun was already drawn, and she moved before he could react. She aimed at the man's hand, taking him out in one swift shot. But as soon as the gunshot rang out, the entire diner exploded into chaos. Screams filled the air as people scrambled to cover. Rebecca dove over the booth, pulling Ethan with her as bullets ripped through the space where they had been sitting seconds before. The other 2 men at the jukebox pulled their guns, opening fire. Rebecca's mind raced. There was no time to think. Just react. She rolled to the side, ducking behind a nearby table, her body instinctively moving as she fired 2 shots, one for each of the men at the jukebox. Both dropped like stones, their weapons clattering to the floor. But there was no time to savor the victory. The man by the door was still alive, and more were coming. Let's go, Rebecca shouted to Ethan, her voice full of urgency. She grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the back exit, her mind calculating their next move. They weren't safe yet, but they would be once they got out of the diner and back on the hunt. The back door of the diner slammed open as Rebecca and Ethan bolted through, the sound of gunfire still ringing in their ears. They ran down the alley, their footsteps pounding against the pavement as the echoes of chaos continued behind them. Rebecca's mind was laser-focused, the adrenaline surging through her veins. Every second counted now. Which way? Ethan gasped, glancing around as they turned the corner. Rebecca's eyes scanned the alley ahead, calculating their escape route. She didn't have much time to think. The diner had been a trap, and now they were being hunted, but she wasn't about to make it easy for them. She spotted the motorcycle parked near the back of a bar, its dark frame hidden in the shadows. That way, Rebecca said, her voice sharp. She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward the bike, not waiting for a second thought. We're getting out of here. As they reached the motorcycle, Rebecca moved swiftly, her hands steady as she prepared the bike. She knew she couldn't waste any time. They needed to move fast, and she wasn't about to let their pursuers catch up. Ethan stood by, glancing nervously behind them. You think this'll be enough to outrun them? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She straddled the motorcycle, firing it up with a roar. If they want to chase us, they'll have to catch us first. Without another word, she revved the engine, and in an instant, the bike shot forward, tearing down the alleyway. Ethan jumped on behind her, holding onto her waist as she weaved expertly through the maze of darkened streets. The engine roared, echoing through the quiet night as they sped away from the diner, the chase now on. Behind them, the sound of screeching tires followed. A car, more likely an SUV, had already come out of the alley, its headlights flashing in the distance. But Rebecca wasn't worried. She'd done this before. She was faster, smarter, and she knew every shortcut the city had to offer. Hold on, she called back to Ethan, her voice full of warning as she leaned into a sharp turn, cutting through a narrow side street. The tires of the motorcycle screamed as it took the curve, barely missing a parked car. Ethan gripped her tightly, his body pressed against hers. Where are we going? He shouted over the wind. Out of their reach, Rebecca replied, her eyes scanning the street ahead. She was calculating every turn, every move, like a chess game in motion. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. She pushed the motorcycle harder, the speed increasing as the city blurred around them. The SUV behind them was gaining ground, its engine growling as it tore through the streets, but Rebecca wasn't worried. She knew what she was doing. She pulled a sharp right, heading down an alley that was barely wide enough for the bike, but she didn't slow down. She had one goal now, get to a place where they couldn't be found. As they sped through the alley, the motorcycle's headlights illuminating the walls around them, Rebecca's heart raced. She could hear the SUV behind them, but it was too big to navigate the tight turns and narrow spaces the way she could. Then, as they neared the end of the alley, Rebecca spotted it. A rusty fire escape leading up to a rooftop just ahead. Perfect. She revved the throttle, the bike surging forward. "Get ready to jump," Rebecca shouted as she accelerated toward the base of the fire escape. Ethan's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. He knew what they had to do. As the bike hit the base of the fire escape, Rebecca pulled up the front wheel, launching them both onto the metal stairs. The motorcycle landed with a thud, and they were on the roof in an instant. Rebecca didn't stop to catch her breath. She hit the gas again, pushing the motorcycle forward as they raced across the rooftop, moving faster than the car could ever catch up. Below them, the sound of the SUV screeching to a halt filled the air. The Black Vipers wouldn't be able to follow them up here, not without making noise. Ethan looked back as they sped across the roof. "You're insane," he said, a grin breaking across his face despite the situation. "But damn, you're good." Rebecca didn't smile. She was focused, her eyes scanning the streets below. They had made their escape for now. But this wasn't over. The Black Vipers were still out there, and so was Kane. The next phase of the mission was just beginning. The rooftop stretched before Rebecca like a labyrinth of abandoned buildings and rusting fire escapes. The wind whipped around her, but she barely noticed. Every fiber of her being was tuned to one thing: survival. Ethan followed closely behind as they navigated the rooftops, the sounds of the city below seeming distant, muffled under the pressure of what was about to come. They had just outrun the Black Viper's SUV, but they weren't safe yet. Rebecca had a plan, and it all led to one place: the military warehouse. The place where the Black Viper's operations were running deeper than ever before. She could feel it in her gut. This was the next piece in the puzzle, and once she had it, nothing would stop her from taking them all down. They reached the edge of the building, and Rebecca paused, scanning the warehouse below. She could see the lights flickering inside, the movement of guards patrolling the perimeter. But it wasn't the guards that worried her. It was what they were guarding. This was where the Vipers kept their weapons, their supplies, and their plans. Rebecca motioned to Ethan, and they moved quickly toward a nearby vent, slipping inside with practiced ease. The air was thick with tension, but Rebecca's every move was deliberate, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. The mission had shifted, but her purpose remained the same: take down the Black Vipers, expose their corruption, and stop Kane. They crouched behind crates, the sounds of muffled voices drifting from beyond the walls. Rebecca's heart raced as she peeked through a crack in the boxes. She could see the guards moving, their weapons at the ready. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced worse than this. "Stay low, stay quiet," she whispered to Ethan. "We need to get inside and find out what they're hiding. We don't know how deep this goes yet." Ethan nodded, his eyes alert as he followed her, his breathing steady despite the danger surrounding them. Rebecca had always known he was resourceful. They made a good team. He covered her back, and she led the charge. But she knew they couldn't do this alone. The Vipers had people everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. They moved like shadows, slipping through gaps and around corners, avoiding the guards' lines of sight. Each step brought them closer to the heart of the warehouse. They could almost taste the danger, feel the gravity of their mission pressing down on them. Every moment, every decision, could mean life or death. They reached a locked door at the far end of the warehouse. Rebecca crouched beside it, her hands moving swiftly as she picked the lock. It clicked open with a soft turn, and she pushed the door open just enough to slip through. Inside, the warehouse was a fortress, boxes of weapons stacked high, crates of mysterious cargo piled in every corner. Rebecca's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could point her toward the Viper's next move. But she wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps approached, echoing off the walls. Rebecca's body tensed. She motioned to Ethan, signaling him to take cover behind a stack of crates. They couldn't be caught now. The guards rounded the corner, their eyes scanning the room. Rebecca's mind raced, her body poised and ready. She wasn't going down without a fight. Her fingers tightened around the gun at her side, and in one smooth motion, she took down the first guard with a quick, precise shot. The others scrambled, their weapons drawn. But they weren't fast enough. Rebecca's training took over as she moved swiftly, eliminating the remaining guards one by one, her every action calculated, precise. The silence that followed was deafening. When it was over, Rebecca exhaled slowly, wiping the sweat from her brow. They'd cleared the room, but there was still more to be done. They had to find the evidence that would expose the Black Vipers for good. Ethan approached her, his expression grim. "What now?" Rebecca glanced around, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something in the corner of the room, something that would change everything. A file, a thick folder, lying in plain sight. It wasn't just paperwork, it was the key to unraveling the entire operation. Now, Rebecca said, her voice steady but filled with determination. We take down Kane. The air felt heavier than ever as Rebecca and Ethan made their way through the dark, labyrinthine hallways of the abandoned warehouse. The file in Rebecca's hand was a ticking time bomb, its contents full of damning evidence. Each step they took toward the center of the building felt like one closer to Kane himself, the man behind the entire operation, the mastermind who had been pulling the strings for far too long. Rebecca was ready for this. She had come too far, fought too hard, to turn back now. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would finally end the Black Viper's reign of terror. But even as she moved forward with purpose, she knew this wouldn't be easy. Kane was smart. He wouldn't go down without a fight. They reached a reinforced door at the end of the hallway. Through the small, grimy window, Rebecca could see movement inside. 2 guards, standing vigil over the entrance. Rebecca motioned for Ethan to stay behind her, and she crouched low, her eyes scanning the area for their next move. The guards weren't aware of their presence, but that wouldn't last long if they didn't act fast. In a swift motion, Rebecca grabbed a small, compact flash grenade from her belt. With one hand, she pulled the pin, and with the other, she hurled the grenade into the room. The loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by the blinding flash of light. It was enough to disorient the guards for just long enough for Rebecca to slip through the door, her gun raised and ready. The guards were down in seconds, one knocked out cold, the other disarmed and restrained by Ethan, who had followed her in, his own gun trained on the room. The 2 men were out of the way, but this was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. They moved through the room quickly, their feet barely making a sound on the concrete floor. The dim light overhead flickered as they approached another door at the far end. Rebecca's instincts were screaming at her to keep moving. This was it, the final confrontation. She pushed the door open with ease, her heart pounding in her chest. And there he was, Kane, sitting behind a large desk, his back to them, completely unaware that his empire was about to come crashing down. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Kane was a man who had everything, money, power, control, but in this moment, Rebecca knew he had lost it all. His empire was crumbling, and he couldn't stop it. You've been hiding in the shadows for too long. Rebecca's voice cut through the silence, sharp and filled with resolve. Kane stiffened, slowly turning his chair to face her, a cold, calculated smile creeping onto his face. Rebecca Cole, he said, his voice smooth, almost admiring. I knew you were a problem, but I didn't expect you to come this far. Ethan stepped forward, his gun still trained on Kane. This ends tonight, Kane. You've been running this city into the ground long enough. It's over. Kane's smile never wavered. You think you've won? Do you have any idea what's really at stake here? You've been chasing shadows, Rebecca. I'm just the beginning. There's so much more you don't know. You're making a dangerous enemy. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. I know exactly who you are, and I know what you've been doing. Your time is up. Kane's expression hardened as he slowly stood from his desk, his hand moving to a drawer beneath it. Rebecca's instincts flared. This wasn't over yet. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, her gun trained on him as he pulled a handgun from the drawer. A single shot rang out, and in that split second, Rebecca's world seemed to slow down. But she wasn't hit. The bullet whizzed past her, grazing her shoulder. She gritted her teeth, but there was no time to react. She returned fire, her shot hitting Kane in the shoulder, knocking him backward. The gun fell from his hand, clattering to the floor as he stumbled. Get on the ground, Rebecca ordered, her voice cold, her gun still aimed at Kane, who was now struggling to stay upright. Kane sneered, his hands gripping the desk as he tried to steady himself. You think this will stop anything? You think you've won? There are others. Bigger forces at play. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. Rebecca stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. No, you're the one who's done playing games. And now, you're going to answer for everything. With a final, decisive motion, she grabbed the file from her jacket, tossing it onto the desk. All the evidence you need to bring down your entire operation, Kane. You've lost. And there's no one left to protect you. Kane glared at her, his face twisted in anger, but there was no more fight left in him. The file was his death sentence, the proof of his involvement in the Black Viper's operations. It was over. Take him away, Rebecca said, signaling to Ethan, who stepped forward and handcuffed Kane. As Kane was dragged away, Rebecca's heart slowly began to steady. The storm was over, the Vipers were done, and with the fall of Kane, a new chapter began. But Rebecca knew that this wasn't the end. The fight for justice would always continue. She stood still for a moment, the weight of the last few days settling in. She had won, But there was still work to be done. The sound of Kane's footsteps echoed in the hallway as Ethan escorted him away, but Rebecca didn't move. She stood there in the middle of the room, her mind racing, her heart still pounding from the intensity of the confrontation. The Black Vipers had fallen. Kane had been taken into custody, the operation exposed for all to see. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Rebecca realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. She looked down at the file on the desk, the evidence of Kane's crimes. It was everything, the key to ending the syndicate and wiping out the corruption that had spread throughout the city. Rebecca knew that once the truth came to light, there would be no place for men like Kane to hide. But even as the weight of the victory settled in, there was still the lingering feeling of unfinished business. She had done what she set out to do. She had brought down the Black Vipers. But now, the city would have to heal. And Rebecca knew she couldn't stay in the shadows forever. The fight was never truly over. It was a cycle. One battle ended, and another would always begin. The door to the office opened, and Ethan stepped back in, his face grim but satisfied. He nodded toward the file. It's done. The network's going down. Every piece of it. Rebecca nodded, though she didn't feel the victory she thought she would. Her mind was already moving ahead. There would be investigations, arrests, and a long road to clean up the mess Kane had left behind. But she knew the truth was now in the open, and that was the first step toward justice. "How's Kane?" she asked, her voice low. "On his way to prison," Ethan replied. "He won't be getting out anytime soon." Rebecca's gaze lingered on the file, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "Good," she said quietly. "But we both know there's more to this. Kane was just a piece of the puzzle. There are more out there, more people with blood on their hands." Ethan's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "You think the Black Vipers are gone for good?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, but this is a major blow, and we've got the evidence to take down the next level. It's just a matter of time before we uncover everything." She glanced out the window, the night sky stretching out before her. The city below was alive, unaware of how close it had come to crumbling under the weight of corruption. But for Rebecca, the job was far from over. She had exposed one of the darkest syndicates the city had ever known. But the fight for justice wasn't something she could walk away from. Not yet. With a final look at Ethan, Rebecca grabbed her gear and headed for the door. "I'll be in touch," she said, her voice steady. Ethan didn't stop her, but he did look at her with a hint of concern. "Be careful. You've made powerful enemies, Rebecca." She smiled, though it was a smile filled with resolve. "I've always had enemies, but now I've got the truth on my side." And with that, she stepped out into the night, ready for whatever came next. Because for Rebecca Cole, the fight wasn't over. It had just begun.